Now on to session 1, China's foreign policy and its international ambitions. Chandran will be moderating this panel, and we are delighted to have Dr. Tim Summers, Professor Zhang Jian, and Professor Warwick Powell on our panel today. If you have any questions for our panelists or the moderator, please enter them in the Q&A box below. Chandran, I'll now hand over the time to you. Please wait for a moment as we welcome the panel to the screen.
Thank you, Renee, and to the panelists. I feel, shall I say, slightly inferior with all the academic titles of our 3 panelists here, but I'll try and hang with you all. So firstly, Professor Tim Summers is Professor, Program Director of the Masters in Chinese Studies at the Center for China Studies at Chinese University in Hong Kong. Professor Zhang, Associate Research Fellow at the Institute for Taiwan, Hong Kong, and Macau Studies at the Shanghai Institute of International Studies, and the Secretary General of the Center for World Political Parties and Politics at the SIRS. And Professor Warwick Powell, well-known internationalist, Chairman at Smart Trade Networks, Senior Fellow at the Tahe Institute, Beijing, author of China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains, and adjunct professor at the Queensland University of Technology. Thank you, gentlemen, for being with us and giving us your time. I think Professor Brown has laid out the big issues. I'm sure all of you will have interpretations of those things. And so what I'd like to do is to invite each of you to make some opening statements of your own in relation to the topic at hand. And then we can engage in a robust conversation and also attempt to answer some of the questions that have been asked. So can I first invite Dr. Summers and can I ask each of you to limit your opening remarks to 4 or 5 minutes, if you don't mind, and then we will open up the conversation. So Dr. Summers, over to you.
Thanks very much, Chandran, and thank you to the organisers for inviting me to join this event this afternoon. I'm speaking from Hong Kong. It's great to be here. So I just want to pick up on a couple of themes that come out of Kerry's presentation and perhaps some of the questions as well. And the first one of those is to think about the making of foreign policy. And we had a question on this in a response to Kerry's keynote speech. And I think, here we've gone through, if we look at Chinese foreign policy historically, we've gone through various stages in the processes of making foreign policy. I mean, broadly put, I think in the reform era, so from 1978 onwards, we've seen a growing pluralization of voices within China in the foreign policy making process. And they could be voices within the state, different parts of the bureaucracy, different administrative organs, but they can also be voices that sit partially or outside the state in academia, in think tanks, in businesses, and so on. And I think what we've broadly seen during this reform era is this growing pluralization, this growing presence of multiple voices. Now, those voices within the system often reflect slightly different emphases or perhaps even different interests. And they therefore reflect, I think, one of the core problems or core challenges for Chinese foreign policy, which is about balancing the multiple different objectives and goals and interests that you have. I mean, we can see this, I think, now, not just in China, but elsewhere in the various discussions about balancing security and economic development. Economic development generally is seen as being promoted by more openness, by more interaction, by more integration. But those in the security sphere tend to see security being maximized by putting in place, if not barriers, then at least mechanisms for screening or for managing to regulate or control external interactions. So we've got this pluralization reflecting multiple interests, but that, I think, underlines a problem, a challenge of how to balance these different interests that are at play in the Chinese foreign policy making process. And I think this has been exacerbated by the growing complexity of the world. This is a theme that Kerry expressed and very eloquently and very clearly. But the external environment which China faces is increasingly complicated and challenging. We have those what we would call non-traditional security threats like climate or pandemics. We have traditional security dynamics, particularly with the United States, but also with some of China's neighbors. We have a global economy which has been going through a difficult period and so on. So this growing complexity, I think, makes formulating a clear foreign policy more and more difficult to do, right? So in answer to your question, Chandran, how do you encapsulate China's foreign policy simply? I think it is very tough because we've got such a complex and fast-changing world out there. So perhaps I will pause here because I don't want to talk for too long for my opening remarks and hand back to Chandran and come back with more comments later on in the discussion.
Just before, Tim, just before you go, one question that I thought I'd like to, get you to clarify a bit more, because I think most people understand China, the Chinese government, as being one in which there is no divergence of opinion, that there is one take, or to the earlier question asked, is it a dictatorship? Or can you shed a bit more light and color to that understanding that you're trying to share with us? Because I think this is such an important point that everyone thinks there's just one voice, there's two or three people, and then one person makes all the decisions, and there's no divergence at all, not in the public space or within the bureaucracy itself.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question. It's important, and it's quite difficult, I think, for us from outside the bureaucratic system to be sure that we've got a good understanding of what's going on here. I'm going to say a couple of things. I think, firstly, I talked about change over time in China's foreign policy making process. I think it's undeniable that there's been a greater degree of centralization in decision making at the national level over the last decade, and that's been in response, perhaps, to some earlier phases of too much plurality or too many competing interests across the bureaucracy. So I think there has been some centralization that's gone on here. But secondly, I think one of the things that I've noticed following Chinese foreign policy over the years is that actually we've got a lot more information available about what is going on, particularly in the Chinese language, of course, but even in the English language, which is easier for me, I confess, and perhaps for many of our audience members as well. And you can see through people producing translations, through Chinese academics who are writing and publishing in international journals overseas, you can see, I think, some different perspectives and approaches, whether it's different theoretical frameworks, whether it's some of the debates that have been in the Chinese foreign policy community over the last decade or so about China's approach to alliances, China's approach to concepts of international responsibility or responsible stakeholder that have been developed in the US in response to China's foreign policy, or even in more recent instances such as the Russia-Ukraine conflict, where I think we've seen some different perspectives and some different emphases among Chinese academics and those commenting. And perhaps one final example, which something that's quite well known overseas in the circles of those who follow Chinese foreign policy, is this idea of wolf warrior diplomacy, the idea of a very sort of strident tone, very tough tone. I think that's a good example, actually, of where we've seen some pushback and some debate, at least within the academic international relations community in China, with various figures who've have suggested that may not have been the best way of handling all of China's external relations. So I think in many of these areas we do actually see different emphases, different priorities, but all with, I think, quite a constructive purpose of trying to improve and enhance the making of foreign policy. I mean, perhaps there's something else to comment on, which I shouldn't go into too much now, but there's I think a difference too between the making of foreign policy and the practice of foreign policy. It's perhaps something we can come back to, because making a foreign policy statement is one thing, implementing it or dealing with the realities on the ground is another thing entirely.
Thank you, Dr. Summers, and thank you for pointing out, which I hope we will get into a bit more, about the difference, and particularly given the external pressures in China and other countries too, the making of foreign policy and its actual implementation on the ground. So thank you so much for that. So now we'd like to hear from Professor Zhang, who's Chinese, a Chinese academic, someone who has, I don't want to put words in his mouth, but who probably has a bit of an insider view and a look and experience to share his thoughts. So Professor Zhang, over to you. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you, Chairman. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Zhang Jian from Shanghai Institute for International Studies, a think tank founded in 1960, based in Shanghai. Thanks to the invitation of the Global Institute for Tomorrow, a young and promising think tank. It's my honor to have this chance to talk about my viewpoints about China foreign policy. In fact, at a great power with long history and deep civilization, just a few words, even this afternoon's discussion is not to understand China's foreign policy. Since the founding of the People's Republic of China in 1949, China's foreign policy is changing, particularly in recent years. With its rise and power growing, China is approaching to the center of the world. It presents new characteristics, and China's ambition is changing. Just now, Professor Kerry Brown mentioned China's foreign policy is facing unprecedented new challenges. Undoubtedly, China's foreign policy not only faces challenges, but also faces many changes. China is making efforts and taking measures to adapt to changes and deal with the challenges. So China and the CPC's foreign policy is a dynamic variation. My viewpoints about China foreign policy just very small features. My viewpoints as follows. First, China's foreign policy's main purpose is to provide a sound external environment for economic development, which is an important aspect of understanding China's diplomacy. Safeguarding and protecting Chinese national interests is another China's foreign policy's purpose. China makes great contribution to the world's economic development and peace protection. But some countries see the rise of China as a geopolitical threat and choose their national security challenge. China government has no China first to sacrifice other countries' interests. It begins at home. 2 months ago, the third plenary session of the 20th Central Committee of the CPC pointed out that geopolitical conflicts are becoming more acute. Undoubtedly, China government is concerned about the spillovers from the Russian-Ukraine war, crisis in the Middle East, and China-US tensions. The third plenary mentioned that despite various uncertainties and even stormy waters ahead, the general direction of human development and progress will not change. Second, my viewpoint is storytelling is an important message and is also an important way to understand China's foreign policy. Storytelling is China's foreign policy's narrative. For the most part, China is presenting itself as a positive and responsible great power. Host diplomatic events at home is one of the important ways to tell China's story. China attaches great importance to develop relationships with global South, Pacific Islands countries, and important period countries, particularly to develop China-Africa relations. 2 weeks ago, the Beijing summit of the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation was held in Beijing. It is the fourth summit since 2006. After 2015, 2018, the summit is a major diplomatic event at home. In 2024, China's Ministry of Foreign Affairs said that the conference is the largest diplomatic event the country has hosted in recent years, with the highest attendance of foreign leaders. Among the 53 countries which have diplomatic relations with China, there are 38 presidents or head of states and 9 prime ministers or head of governments attended the summit. China tells the world that it was a great reunion of the China-African big family. As we know, last year, the Third Belt and Road Forum for International Cooperation was successfully held in Beijing, taking Belt and Road cooperation to a new stage of high-quality development. Also last year, China Central Asia Summit was held in China, Xi'an, creating a new platform for China and neighboring countries. Last year, the BRICS mechanism also achieved a historic expansion, adding some new strengths to this mechanism. Third, my viewpoint is China's wolf warrior diplomacy. Wolf warrior diplomacy has attracted worldwide attention, but the so-called wolf warrior diplomacy is not the whole of China's foreign policy. The so-called wolf warrior diplomacy is a negative term of Chinese diplomacy. The nickname is a narrative trap. Some diplomats with a hawkish style made them to be the most prominent practitioners of what widely became known as wolf warrior. Some international observers think that Xi Jinping has adopted an assertive approach to promoting China interests. They think that Xi Jinping abandoned Deng Xiaoping's low-profile foreign policy of avoiding confrontation with the United States and other Western powers. Some other observers have criticized the wolf warrior diplomacy approach as counterproductive, as it can lead to increased tensions and conflicts with other countries. Others argue that it reflects China's growing global power and roles and assertiveness, and that it may be a necessary response to preserve and protect China's national interests. China is a rising power and faces uncertainties. Wolf warrior diplomacy just is one way to safeguard national interests. It's not to invade or interfere other countries' internal affairs. The world should have more understandings about the rising Chinese action. Fourth, my first viewpoint is China is committed to responsibly manage the disputes with major power and neighboring countries by strategic communication. China and the United States have different narratives about strategic competition. In China's perspective, strategic perception is very important, but America's perception to China is unacceptable. China argues that America's strategic communication is to contain China. U.S. regards the rise of China as a geopolitical challenge to its hegemony and to its world position. From Obama administration's pivot to Asia-Pacific rebalancing, to Trump's Indo-Pacific strategy, and to Biden administration's multilateral lattice-like strategic architecture, the main purpose is to contain China. President Biden and its allies in Europe stressed to de-risk, not decouple from China economy in recent years, but it's a way to contain China. In China's perspective, decoupling and de-risking is the same. The essence is not changed. My last viewpoint is China is providing more and more public goods to the world. The Belt and Road Initiative proposed in 2013 is the biggest public goods China provided to the world. In recent years, China proposed another important public goods, just the 3 initiatives: the Global Development Initiative, the Global Security Initiative and the Global Civilization Initiative, in the hope that all countries will join hands to build a community with a shared future for mankind. Just this panel one's topic. I think in recent years, Chinese modernization will provide more new opportunities for countries around the world and inject new impetus into safeguarding world's economy and peace. China, in last, China also facilitated the historic reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran, setting a new example of political settlement of hotspot issues. That's all. Thank you.
Professor Zhang, thank you very much. I think what you've shared is something that is often not heard, an insider's view, someone who's an academic in China. And I particularly liked your point about this topic of the wolf warrior, which I'm sure we will get into, and how that's being discussed and how it has been positioned around the world. But you clarified it's not representative in terms of what China's foreign policy is. So before I go on to the next, to Professor Powell, I would like to ask one question. Last week, I was on a panel addressing an audience in Europe, and an American who is resident in China and extremely well versed with China talked about China, that the need for others to understand that China is a civilization, and you just mentioned that in your opening remarks. Can you just, perhaps for others to understand, just talk a bit about how do you reference the civilization issue in relation to Chinese foreign policy?
Thank you. I think China is with a long history. Some thinking thought about China's foreign policy are from China's civilization and history. As we know, so many economic development source and foreign policy source are from China's ancient dynamics from ancient. In recent years, China is spreading its civilization to the world, not a revolution. It's civilization, not a revolution. As we know, in China and the United States relations, President Xi Jinping also mentioned that the United States should have more understanding about China's civilization, China's history. Xi Jinping also pointed out that in China-US relations, the number one issue is the two major countries' understanding and their perception. But the United States and other countries have many misperceptions to China's foreign policy, to China's foreign policy ambition. So I think the civilization is very important, but the civilization is very big. It's not one or two words to speak what is civilization. If you have a chance, come to China, you can see many people, just normal people, also have some reflection about China's civilization. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. I can certainly attest to your remark that in China, where I've been in many places, it's very interesting to me to meet ordinary people who have a deep understanding of both culture and civilization. So your point is, at least for me, extremely pertinent and relevant. I myself experienced that. Now I'd like to invite Professor Powell. Professor Powell, you've written a great deal, spoken a great deal about the issues from the Australian perspective, but also from a global perspective. You've listened to our keynote speakers, the views from Dr. Summers and Dr. Zhang. Over to you. Please share your wisdom with us, and particularly your take on this whole issue of Chinese foreign policy. Over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Chandran. It's a great pleasure to be with everyone today, and it has been very informative to take on board what the other speakers have already said. It's always one of the benefits of being the last to speak is that I get to listen in on everyone else first. Look, I'll keep my remarks brief, of course, and in response to the big question, which is how is it that we can come to understand this issue of Chinese foreign policy? My general take is to view it through the lens of it being a work in progress. Chinese foreign policy is an evolutionary activity, both at an intellectual level, as well as at a level of institution building and practical implementation. And as a work in progress, it seeks to draw from a rich history of Chinese statecraft, of philosophical thinking, as well as more contemporary experiences to arrive at a perspective on China itself as a country and as a civilization, and its understanding of how countries relate to each other in the world, and shape a framework that it hopes can lead to a pathway towards stability, prosperity, and peace. Now, this framework has a number of important distinctive features. The philosophical foundations really sees the world in holistic terms, that all parts of the universe are interrelated and that no parts are disconnected from others. In practical terms, this means that the relationships between nations and civilizations with each other are not relationships of atomic or disparate entities that somehow from time to time collide and interact with each other, but that in fact the way that a particular nation is and a particular civilization is can only be understood through its interactions with others and vice versa. So this idea of indivisibility becomes a prominent feature in the way that Chinese foreign policy and the philosophical underpinnings seek to understand the nature of our world. And we see that in the three principal documents that the previous speaker noted, which is the Civilization Initiative, the Development Initiative, and the Security Initiative, all of which seek collectively to articulate a conceptual and philosophical framework towards this question of Chinese foreign policy. In addition to drawing from its own philosophical traditions to articulate this kind of framework, it's also, I think, pitching a framework that contrasts with the framework that has dominated the ways in which foreign affairs has been treated over the course of at least, say, the last 30 years, if not a little bit longer. And I'm talking about the era of unipolarity and the particular liberal discourse of the rules-based international order that has tended to dominate the ways in which foreign relations has been conceptualized and the institutions and the practical outputs of foreign relations practice during this period of American unipolarity. So the Chinese approach seeks not only to draw on its own deep philosophical traditions, but in doing so actually puts forward a framework that contrasts quite substantially with the approach that has underpinned the rules-based international order. Perhaps I'll leave it at that, but I just wanted to, I guess, really hone in on this conceptual foundation, which is the sense of holism and the interrelatedness of all things as the starting point, rather than the idea that the world is comprised of fragmented atoms that somehow bump into each other from time to time.
Professor
Over
Powell,
to you, Chandran.
Professor Powell, thank you very much. I have two little questions to ask before I open up the discussion and then Q&A from the floor as well. Do you think this philosophical underpinning that you talk about is actually understood in the other centers of power? That's the first one. or dismissed as the musings of academics and others, or just Chinese thinking Chinese. And the second is that you have talked about the rich history of trans-civilizational interaction before Europeans that the Chinese hold to. I wonder if you could just, give us a bit more clarity on those 2 points. Thank you.
I think this idea of holism is actually a conceptual or philosophical struggle point for many who, I guess, are comforted by the European intellectual tradition that has very much been built on the Descartesian dualism that has been around for the last 500 years or so. The idea of holism and the integrated interrelatedness of all parts as your starting point has actually not been part of the Western philosophical canon for a long time. So I think it is a difficult starting point conceptually, philosophically, and ontologically for many in the West to get their heads around. There is, of course, a Western philosophical tradition that predates the Descartes or the Cartesian revolution that does have a lot more of these holistic notions. And perhaps if the West was able to reach back beyond Kant and beyond Descartes, they could find within its own philosophical canons some of the threads of this holistic thinking that can open up different ways of thinking about the interrelationships between peoples and nations. And of course, not just the interrelationship between peoples and nations, but the interrelationships between all things, including the relationship between people and the natural world in which we are embedded. So I think that that's the first thing. The extent to which the ideas are dismissed, I think, really comes down to a refusal to accept that it is possible for there to be alternative views of the world. And that comes largely from a Western millenarian tradition that has framed the world in terms of good and evil, whereby the West is the bearer of the civilizational impetus of history and has both a right and an obligation to impose its version of the world onto everybody else. I think that particular approach has come up against a bit of a rock, and that rock, of course, is China on the rise.
Thank you, Professor Powell. For those of us who study these things or are keen observers, I think you've hit on something that I have thought about often or discussed, but not been able to articulate as well as you have. So I think there's something here that is really important. It's almost as if we're talking across purposes, the 2 blocks of power, the different ideologies, the different histories, but also the different philosophical underpinnings. So let me open up and invite first Dr. Summers. Would you like to comment on the philosophical underpinning, the civilizational issues, but also then perhaps talk to us, Tim, about the sitting in Hong Kong and looking at how the interpretation of China's foreign policy is manifested in terms of the relations between China and how Hong Kong is caught in between and the rest of the world. What are your views in terms of what Professor Brown talked about, that we need to work really hard to bridge this gap? How does one go about this, given these, in fact, even philosophical differences in understanding history and culture? I hope that's an unfair question, but you are Dr. Summers.
Well, thanks for prompting, I think, 2 very, very, very challenging questions. And I found Warwick's comments to be fascinating. And I think there's a lot here in this idea of different ways of seeing the world. But I also want to see if I can qualify this a little bit without trying to be more of a philosopher than I am. I mean, I think, one of the features of China's historical process over the last, I mean, its existence, but at least over the last couple of hundreds of years, has been the way that the country has been shaped and reshaped through its interactions with other parts of the world, including with the West. And we need to turn this around too, because the West, the modern West, the capitalist West would not be the way it is without its own interactions with other parts of the world. And I see there's a question there in the chat about Western history of colonialism, and that's a good example of how the current West in its current form has been shaped through its interactions with other parts of the world. But I think when it comes to China, we perhaps have multiple strands of thinking that inform of the way that Chinese foreign policy elites see the world. So yes, there is a holism. There's an emphasis on the sort of oneness, right, in contrast to the atomistic perspective. But I think there's also quite strong strands of thought that think about the world as a world of states in competition. I mean, realist approaches in international relations where states compete for power and security have quite a strong intellectual market in China. We perhaps can see in Chinese foreign policy in the early part of the People's Republic era, there's a post-colonial strand, the sort of Bandung spirit. There's also a kind of Cold War idea, although the Chinese elites didn't talk about Cold War, didn't use this phrase, but the idea of sort of imperialist competition. So there's I think what I'm trying to say is to sort of respond a little bit to Warwick's comments and say perhaps there are multiple philosophical and intellectual underpinnings of the way that Chinese foreign policy elites see the world today, and that feeds into a much more complicated foreign policy picture. Perhaps some of those elements come to the fore in some contexts. Sometimes we see this post-colonial element come to the fore in relations with parts of the global majority. Sometimes we see the competition for power and security come to the fore when it's looking at relations with the United States. So I think this is this is a complicated picture. But perhaps also I was just wondering, when you asked about how to bridge the gap, I think highlighting difference is important because there are differences. There are different historical traditions, cultural assumptions, experiences, and so on. But also when we think about the intertwining, the influence that different civilizations and peoples have had on each other, that can perhaps provide a way to help us bridge the gaps. And as Kerry said at the start of his talk, when it comes to some major global challenges and problems at the moment, there's not so much difference actually between the major powers in the world, and not so much difference between China and other players. And so perhaps one way of bridging the gaps is to think about what is the problem, what is the question that we're trying to address. And if it's a question that's a global question about global challenges, about the future of humanity on this planet, then there ought to be ways of bridging those gaps that are much easier than if we are focusing our attention and our questions on what our perspectives are or what our national interest is in different contexts, which somehow tends to lead us down a path of highlighting difference, of highlighting competition, and of highlighting conflict. So I'm not sure, Chandran, I've done a very good job at being practical or pragmatic in answering your questions, and slightly more reflections on some of the previous conversation, but perhaps you can, I can pass it back to you for follow-up.
No, thank you, Tim. You've been intellectually robust, and I think this is what we require. Because as you and everyone else knows, these are complicated issues. The nuances need to be understood, and all we're trying to do in this sort of forum is bring that. And I think your answer at least helped me a great deal to kind of understand. There's no cut and dry answer to these. So thank you. Professor Zhang, can I come to you and ask you a question, which I think is rather important in terms of getting people to understand. Professor Zhang, can you hear me? Yes, you can. You were quite clear from a Chinese perspective, and I want people to also understand that I don't think you're speaking for the Chinese government, but as a Chinese academic, it's important that sometimes people think that every time someone Chinese speaks, they're speaking for the government. But you made an important point that within China, there is a sense, and I've detected it myself, that given the sort of we must contain China at all costs, which has sort of accelerated in the last 5 years, particularly, there is a view amongst Chinese who are not necessarily, diehard nationalists that why are you trying to contain us? Coming back to Professor Brown's point, we are 1.4 billion people. We are seeking prosperity. We need to be interacting with the world. So you talked about this view that, Chinese feel that the attempts to contain it are unfair. I think most objective people would say it is unfair because it hurts a lot of people. But then you also said that there's a view within the rest of the world that suggests that President Xi has essentially abandoned Deng and that wants to confront the West. And he said, this is not true. Could you give us a bit more flavor about so that we can understand this? Because there is a common interpretation, linked to the wolf warrior that it's all aggression, they are asserting their muscle, and they want to dominate the world. And it's a departure from the Deng era, etc. So can you, from a Chinese perspective, let us understand where the consistency is, but where perhaps you see a bit of a departure, but it's not a threat to the world, please.
Thank you. As we know, in the past 2 decades, there are many perceptions from America about China, such as responsible stakeholder, strategic reassurance, G2, etc. From Trump administration, America put out many new conceptions about China, such as decoupling, small yard, high fence, de-risking. China don't agree, use the competition to oppress China-US relations, because in China's perspective, the competition is not fair. China is not fear of competition, but the competition is unfair because, as you know, America put up some traps, such as overcapacity. In the past year, overcapacity is very popular in the world. So, in Chinese perspective, America's purpose is to contain China, but China, win or lose is not China's purpose. China, it begins at home. China is making efforts to deal with China's internal affairs, including economic development, social stability, and Taiwan Strait. So, in China's perspective, the containment is not China's acceptance. But in the past several decades, America's foreign policy to China, engagement as China's in China is very popular. So between engagement and containment, in China's perspective, engagement is China's choose. The second question is about China's foreign policies, whether abandon low-profile foreign policy. As we know, in the past several decades, particularly with opening up and reforming, China's power is growing. In Deng Xiaoping era, China is very weak. Although China is a big country, but the power is very weak. So Deng Xiaoping take up the low-profile foreign policy. But with China's power growing, particularly come to Xi Jinping's take office, take power, China is becoming number 2 in economic power. China cannot hide its power. China's action in the world, just a small action can catch the world's attention. So it's not China change its foreign policy about low profile. It's just the world is changing, China is changing. So the world's understanding about China's foreign policy is changing. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. A really good reminder that China's foreign policy is changing because China has also become a superpower. And during President Deng, it was a much weaker. And of course, even me living in Hong Kong, when Hong Kong gained its, went back to the sovereign in 1997, I think Hong Kong's GDP as a part of China was something over 25% or 27, somewhere between 25 and 30. Today, Hong Kong's portion of the GDP is less than 3. So, as you said, because China became so big, any action taken by China had global implications, and people had to understand that. So that's a really good reminder. And the issue of embracing China as well, and if we lived in a world where there was more openness, I was just I read a report today that the American basketball player Stephen Curry is in China at the moment, and he is so popular that everywhere he went, crowds essentially gathered that they had to cancel quite a few of his tour. He wanted to go to Xi'an, I believe, and they had to cancel it because they were afraid there'd be riots trying to embrace Stephen Curry. So that's the world we look forward to, in which we can all participate in the positive things. And I like your point about China doesn't want to define its relationship with the US through simply competition. Professor Powell, there's a question for you here. For everyone who sees the essence of the international relationships, how do you think we should prepare to deal with the coming possible conflicts? It seems to presume a conflict is inevitable. I think Professor Brown said, don't even think about it, don't even entertain it. But here's a question that suggests that there is a coming conflict. Do you think these conflicts are far away, or are they just around the corner? And to that, I may just add my little prompt as well. Living in Australia in the Asia-Pacific region is probably seen as the strongest ally of the United States. And part of, if I could say, part of the containment, and with AUKUS and those arrangements, which has drawn a lot of concern, not just in China, but across Southeast Asia as well. Could you care to comment on those points, please?
Yeah, with pleasure, Chandran. Let's put this into a little bit of historical context, because this is actually part of the ways in which China has come to understand not only itself, but its relationship with the world, and how others in the world seek to treat it and frame it. If we go back 130, 140 years or thereabouts, and I mean into the period after the Opium Wars, what we saw was a dramatic influx of missionaries, Christian missionaries, Protestant missionaries, predominantly from the United States, heading into China in the late 1800s, with a clear view of proselytizing the Christian message so as to transform China. Now, it achieved significant success heading into the 1910s and 1920s, so much so that the Republican government of the time became heavily influenced by the gospel of Christianity. So much so, again, that Chiang Kai-shek and his wife were baptized, and ultimately, come the early 1950s, McCarthy, in that very famous speech of his in 1951, actually described Chiang Kai-shek as fighting our war meaning America's war. And the context of those remarks was actually a spiritual war. So it wasn't just a question of a material war or a war of munitions. it was a spiritual war. So that's the first point to remember. And I think that that lesson has not been lost on most people within China. And as it draws on its rich history of its own philosophical richness, I think it is finding strength in its own depth, particularly as a reaction to what has been a historic attempt to impose Western religions into China. The second thing to bear in mind is a more recent phenomenon, and that is the post-1990 phenomenon, where the United States embarked on 3.7 military interventions on average per year. Now, during the Cold War period, 46 to 1990, the number was 2.4. So in the era when the United States was arguably at its most secure, without any peer competitor around, it actually initiated more interventions than at any other time previous. And again, that shapes the way in which other countries think about their operating environment and how they need to adapt their thinking to firstly protect themselves and to advance the ways in which they think their interests, not only in a narrow realist sense, but how those interests can be secured institutionally in the long run through the creation of transnational relationships that are far more indivisible than the realist tradition would admit. So we've got two very, very strong threads of historic antagonism directed towards China. Now, the period that people often look back to, which is this last 30 years of American engagement, now that wasn't done so because suddenly the United States became a benign player in the world. It was done so as a refashioning of the spiritual war, where the United States post-1990 quite clearly hoped that the pursuit of neoliberal engagement with China and the entanglement of China with American global capitalism would ultimately transform China in ways that America wanted it to be transformed, in the image that America wanted it to see. Now, that entire enterprise came to an end in the mid-2010s, and eventually guys like Kurt Campbell started to write in 2018 about the Great Lament, which was that China dared defy Washington. China did not change in the ways that Washington wanted it to. And you might recall in February this year, Jake Sullivan gave a talk where he talked explicitly about the fact that the United States has spent the past few decades seeking to mold or to change China, and it failed. And it failed. Now, that is the context in terms of understanding what the drivers of conflict are. This millenarian zealotry, this belief in a spiritual mission to transform other parts of the world. If the other parts of the world aren't to be saved, then they are to be vanquished. That has been the underpinning driver of American economic and spiritual colonialism for the best part of the last 100+ years. Is there going to be conflict? Well, we know that there are many in Washington who are gearing up for one, who are talking up the possibilities of conflict by 2027, etc., etc. We know what the modus operandi is, and that is to lay the seeds of regional instability, to groom proxies. It's not the first time that the United States have done this. They've done this elsewhere before, but the idea of destabilizing regions to cause conflict is exactly what's playing out today. And this is what we need to be very careful of, this issue of intra-regional conflict, but also the sowing of the seeds of national destabilization through the work of so-called NGOs. We're starting to see it play out in the region. Talk about conflict. Yes, these are the portends for very, very choppy waters coming up.
Thank you. Thank you. Tim, can I ask you then to kind of respond a bit to that? There are those who suggest that anytime you try and reflect the Chinese position within the mainstream media and the mainstream understanding of these things, and you suggest that China is essentially at the forefront of of a push to contain it for whatever reasons, historical, as Professor Powell has mentioned, then you're seen as being a China sympathizer. You're seen as being not realistic or anti-American. I mean, where do we find common ground, this sort of polarized understanding, where you can't even suggest that we should try and find a voice? And you teach international students, etc. How do you navigate that? How do you respond to the sort of narratives we need to be able to articulate, which are truthful, but don't seek to also divide? And how do we get politicians, particularly as Kerry said, in the political West, to spend a bit more time understanding the nuances of a very complex region and a very complex large nation?
Yeah, it's difficult, Chandran, and I think you're right to point out that it can be difficult to go against the consensus and the consensuses that exist on China. I mean, I think on the slightly more optimistic side, if I can be a bit brave, there are people who try, certainly, and occasionally we do hear some different voices, so that's good. But I think those consensus points of view are quite strong. I mean, one of them is what Warwick referred to, the idea of the failure of engagement, which has become a consensus view in the US. Actually, I would say it's probably it may have failed in some senses, given the sorts of goals that people had for changing China. But it hasn't failed to transform China in lots of ways. China is a very, very different place today because of the deep engagement with the West and other parts of the world over the last 30 years. I mean, there's another example of a sort of consensus view in one of the questions about whether China is an existential threat to the US and how to respond to that. And I think we just have to try to keep putting out good, reasoned, rational arguments, try to give evidence to counter those views, but also to understand why those views are there and where they come from. I mean, perhaps there's reasons why many in American policy circles think China is an existential threat that China can't do very much about at all. Right? It may tell us more about the United States than it tells us about China. There's not a lot then that China can do to respond, but to the extent that it's possible to challenge that through reasoned argument, through evidence, and I think pointing out what you've been pointing out, Chandran, the problems of very one-sided narratives that seem to dominate our airwaves on China today. So it's a long, difficult process to challenge this, and I'm not sure that I can offer any more optimism than to say just keep trying to plug away at it.
Well, thank you, and that's what this little attempts with these conferences is, to try and get as many views together, because there are very few forums where we can have this. And my role here is to make sure that there's no Western bashing or anti-China sentiment. And as you pointed out, Tim, we live in a world where you have to be on one side or the other. And so, the brave ones, I include all three of you and our other panelists, we're trying to say it's much more difficult, but we have to form narratives and engage with people around the world. Professor Zhang, a question for you. So if you were to represent China for a little while in, say, Europe or the United States, and also advise the Chinese government, what are the two or three things you would advise the Chinese government to embrace or do differently, given what you've already said is an ongoing effort to, if I can use the word, contain it? What would you tell the Chinese government to adjust or recalibrate? What should it do? I mean, you run a think tank, I'm sure you give advice, so I hope I'm not putting you in a difficult spot.
Thank you. As a researcher in a think tank based in China, as we know, China's some think tanks are affiliated to government. So we have some chances to provide viewpoints to the central government or Shanghai government. Just now you said that if I have this chance, maybe I have, I will tell China government, first, China government should to have a relatively good relation with the Western countries, have a relatively good relations in order to have a good strategic communication to other countries. Second, I will tell China government, China should should provide more public goods to the world, including United Nations, to the developing regions like such as Africa, Latin America, and even some South Asia countries. But in fact, China is doing for example, in our think tank, SIS, we are doing some young leadership, including scholars, journalists, and some young diplomats. We are inviting them to China from South Africa, such as Pakistan, Bangladesh, and a few from India. I think this can make China and the neighboring countries have a good relation. The last one, if I have this chance, I will tell China government should support new items to China's internal development, including some small and middle enterprises. As we know, in recent years, particularly in the past 2 years, China's economy is relatively declining. Many enterprises is facing challenges. So China government should support more chances for the enterprises. In fact, we are talking about power politics, but many companies, they are facing close competition crisis. So government should provide more opportunities for the enterprises. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Zhang. There's a question, Professor Powell, that I wondered if you would respond to. And again, I've taken the liberty of adding a bit to it. If you were to have an opportunity, or should I say, you do through your writings, etc., try to influence public opinion in Australia. You're well read throughout the world. What do you think needs to be done to get Western powers, particularly the United States, to take a more nuanced and reasonable approach to China, given what Professor Zhang has said? But bearing in mind, and this is where the other question is, that Westerners seem afraid about China. Why? So how does one, there seems to be a fear of China. What is it? I think you alluded to in your previous remarks, but that again gets us all into sort of, trouble. You're just blaming the West, or you're not understanding the China threat. So how does one get, the political West to understand what I think Professor Brown referred to, that a confrontation is in no one's interest. A poor China is not good for the world, as would be a poor United States or declining United States. How do we talk to politicians and world leaders about this?
Well, China's not going to go away. That's the first thing that people in the West actually need to get their heads around, that China is a civilization that's been around 5,000 years. And right now, in the first quarter of the 21st century, China is on the rise and has been for the past 40, 50 years. Now, that's just a fundamental fact, that wishing that China could be dealt with, that you could somehow bring it to its knees, is a fantasy that is both dangerous as it is impractical. It's dangerous because it provokes reactions that ultimately can create a spiral of hostility risk intensification, which ultimately could lead to some very, very bad kinetic outcomes. But I think the die has been cast to a large extent for many Western elites for the time being. It's a legacy of history, of course, but it's also a function of contemporary circumstances where Western elites are confronting domestic circumstances that are less than desirable. We do have challenges in Europe. We have challenges in the United States in terms of income distribution, in terms of the quality of life of ordinary citizens, and in terms of the ability of their respective political economies to ultimately live up to the promises of the dreams that they propose to be able to deliver. So domestic politicians are confronted with domestic problems. In that context, it's actually very easy to blame the unknown other. That's the first point. I don't think that there's much to be done in the short term in relation to domestic politicians. Domestic politicians' attitudes change when crises force change. For instance, we're starting to see in the European context a significant public reaction against the political establishment. Now, 3-4 years ago, it would have been unheard of, but now we have the rise of both what would have been known as the far right and to some extent a renewed and re-energized left in response to the failure of the political establishment to address the real problems of society and economy. I think lastly, what I would say is that we need to be able to speak directly to people through events such as this, where it's not just a question of tier one communications, so to speak, but where the communications and engagements are actually happening at real human levels, tier twos or track twos and track threes. The opportunities for people to visit each other's countries, I think, is potentially transformational, and we need to continue to press for easier channels of travel, whilst at the same time, I guess, trying to knock back the naysayers who are trying to create problems for people to travel, and at the very least, to open their own eyes and see what life is like in these other parts of the world. So very challenging times again. There's no quick fixes. I mean, these are embedded problems handed down by history that will take their own good time to work their way through the body politic.
Thank you, Professor Powell, and thank you for reminding us that the people-to-people diplomacy, which this is an attempt at, is really the basis. And I, for one, have been extremely grateful to the Commissioner's Office of the Chinese Foreign Ministry in Hong Kong for enabling us to do this. We've got 5 minutes left, so I'm going to ask you all to take 1 minute to respond to a very simple ask. What would you want everyone who's listening, and the thousands who will listen to this recording, literally the last one was, I think, viewed and listened to by over 30,000 people, things like those numbers. If you wanted people to take away one thing, what is it? What would that be? Can I start with you, Dr. Summers?
Yeah, thanks. I think complexity. So this is a complex country with many different ideas, many different people. It's a rich country with a long history, interacts with the world in multiple different ways. Try to get to grips with some of that complexity as best as possible, and perhaps that means challenging some of the things that we've heard or some of the things that we've assumed in the past.
So your ask for people is to understand complexity, try and understand those things. Professor Zhang, what would you want people who are going to listen to this or listening right now to take away from this conversation?
Thank you. It begins at home. Power politics is very remote for us. We should do ourselves at home, not for country, but for ourselves. Thank you.
All right. Sort out the politics at home before you sort out the politics overseas, which sort of lends to what Professor Powell had said before about how domestic politics in powerful countries then create turbulence elsewhere. Professor Powell, last word to you.
Try to think beyond dualism. The world isn't good and evil. It's complicated, as Tim said, and it is intertwined with each other. Our existence as individuals are intertwined with the existence of every other individual and with the world around us. And what we need to be doing is making it clear to the political establishment that warfare is actually not something that we want, and that we want political elite to find ways of coexisting, and hopefully beyond mere coexistence, but in a framework that can achieve the benefits that the collective humanity can actually achieve together when we throw our collective creative capacities together.
Thank you, Professor Powell. Wise words. Don't oversimplify, don't make it just about dualism, and understand that we live in a complex, connected world. Gentlemen, I want to thank you so much. Our time's up. I could go on talking to you, but one thing I do know is that I learned a great deal. We have lots of questions, and I suspect that this particular session will be very popular on the internet. So thank you so much for taking your time, but most importantly, for providing us with insights. We're not just ideologically leaning to one side or the other, and providing us with really a bit of deep insights and respecting all sides of the debate and giving the audience food for thought. So thank you very, very much. And I will look forward to meeting you in person. Tim, I'm sure we would bump into each other somewhere in Wan Chai or Central or somewhere. Professor Zhang, I hope to meet you in Beijing, in Shanghai. And Professor Powell, if we don't meet in Hong Kong, I'll trek out to Australia and hope to meet you there too. So thank you once again, everyone, for being here. Thank you for the audience. I'm going to hand over to Rene because we have a stellar session coming up. Next, we'll dig deeper from an external perspective. We have an African view, an Indian view, a view from the South China Sea and the Philippines, and a view from Australia. So please hang on. Over to you, Rene. Thank you once again, gentlemen.
Thank you. Bye-bye.